But yeah, if you read enough, people will take you seriously because you know stuff.
Hello, my friends, and welcome to the Personal Responsibility Lawyer Podcast. I am your host, Michael Lovins of the law firm Lovins Trosclair. Lovins Trosclair is, of course, as always, the sponsor of this podcast. We are personal injury trial lawyers, and you will hear a little bit more about us later in the show. My guest on today's show is Shoshana Weissmann. Shoshana manages social media for the R Street Institute, which is a free market think tank in Washington, D.C. You're going to hear a little bit more about what they do in the interview. Shoshana is Twitter famous. I first heard of her through mutual real-life friends, not just Twitter followers, and so I followed her on Twitter. Her handle is @SenatorShoshana, and she's mostly hilarious. What really caught my attention, though, was when people would see Senator on her Twitter handle, think she was a real United States Senator, and then complain at her, that's putting it mildly, for not doing her job and for being part of the problem with government not getting anything done or getting the wrong things done or whatever their complaint of the day happened to be. So people would gripe at her, and that kind of caught my attention because it was kind of funny that they were so easily misled. But her replies are what really got me, because they would complain and she would respond and say, well, if you would just send $10,000 to my office, I will be happy to look into that for you. There's just no shortage of ignorance on Twitter, and sometimes that request to be bribed would bring further rage, and I shouldn't think that's funny, but I'm just not mature enough to pass up that laugh. But that's not really what Twitter's Senator and I talk about in this interview. We talk about occupational licensing reform, which is one of her favorite and most oft talked about issues. She knows a lot about it, why it's important for both freedom and for prosperity for those of us who do need occupational licenses and those of us who don't. So without further ado, please enjoy my conversation with Shoshana Weissmann. Today we have an exciting first for this podcast, which is we have as our guest a sitting senator from the great state of Twitter, Shoshana Weissmann. Shoshana, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
So the first thing that I think everybody needs to know is two things. One, how did you get to be a senator? And two, how many people have actually responded to your invitation to send thousands of dollars to your office so that you will take action on their behalf when they complain that you're not doing your bleeping job?
So when I was 14, I wanted to be an actual senator. And that never happened, which is good because I would hate to be a senator, and that sounds like a terrible job. So when I was younger, I became like Senator Shoshana on any social media I joined. And then it just stuck, and then I got verified. So I'm like, oh, I guess I'll keep doing this. So it's a pretty simple story, but it's kind of depressing how many times people think I'm an actual senator, and no one's even sent the money. So it's like, if you want to bribe me, just be serious about it. Like, come on.
That probably is one of the. So I think we have a mutual friend who had initially said, "Oh, you got to follow Senator Shoshana. She's hilarious." And so I followed you on Twitter, and then what actually caught my attention, I think, was people calling you out for not doing your job. And then the part I liked the most was your invitation to send in a bribe, which that's just beautiful in a Twitter sort of way.
Thank you. It's funny. Not a lot of people know this, but I was actually inspired by Homer Simpson when he had the auto dialing thing, like, please send $1. And then when he had to apologize, he's like, if you accept my apology, please send $1. So I just always thought that was funny. And then I'm like, hey, why don't I give this a shot? So Simpsons did it, to quote South Park, but I just thought it would be fun to do that, and like actual senators call me senator and get a kick out of it. Like, they all think it's really fun, so it's nice. I don't know, like, politics is awful so many times, so it's nice to just be able to have some fun with it.
So you are not a lawyer, but you work with R Street. Tell us what R Street is and what you do for them.
So we're a free market think tank. We do lots of things, basically everything except health insurance. and tax policy, unless it relates to our other stuff. We've never really touched health insurance, but with tax policy, occasionally we will. But we do the sexier kind of insurance, which is flood insurance. If you want to know about that, talk to our people. We do basically every tech and telecom policy, from autonomous vehicles to like FCC policy and even copyright and intellectual property. We have a big commercial freedom area too that does zoning, more access to birth control, and also occupational licensing reform, a ton of criminal justice reform, national security. So basically, really everything, and harm reduction, which is a really cool area. Just figuring out how to help people get off cigarettes and onto vapes, because a lot of people use that to quit smoking. So it's really interesting, and I'm always learning here. Like I feel really dumb working around with such smart people all day.
So what is your role with R Street?
I manage our digital media, so all of our social media, a lot of graphics, some video, though I have a colleague who helps out with that a lot. Most of our website, and email marketing is also a big thing, and list organizing. But I'm also a fellow, so I work on occupational licensing reform when I have time, as well as some court policy. I'm a huge fan of Professor Randy Barnett, and the poor guy has to put up with me. And judges like Justice Willett and Gorsuch, who is like the dream. So I just get to do whatever I want all day, and it's a pretty great job.
So, and you did not go to law school. You're not a practicing lawyer, but you dive into a lot of policy issues that have a lot of legal angles to them. And so, how did you get yourself up to speed on that sort of topic?
I just read a lot.
Read a
for
lot.
only the past
What kind
couple
of
of years.
weirdo are you? Come
Yeah,
on.
honestly, that's most of it. I got into the Ninth Amendment and unenumerated right stuff through Barnett when I was 19. I've been a member of the Federalist Society since I was 16, and I credit them with a lot of it too. I went there to learn, and I got more than I could ever know. I mean, they're fantastic. So being a member of the Federalist Society and reading lots of books, lawyers and scholars often tell me that I know more about law than most lawyers. And I used to think they were joking and just being nice because I still don't feel like I know all that much. But turns out I do, and that's kind of terrifying because I feel like there's plenty I don't know. But yeah, if you read enough, people will take you seriously because you know stuff. So that's the
It
gist
is
of
amazing
it.
that even without the occupational license to practice law, actually knowing stuff gives you some credibility. So that's actually good to know because you can trick people by putting senator in your Twitter handle, but you can only fake actually knowing things for so long. And especially with the smart people that are around Federalist Society stuff, if you didn't actually know something, they'd notice it pretty quick.
Oh yeah, it's not like you can BS them. They're really smart people. But I still feel inadequate around them. They're just brilliant, brilliant people. And I'm glad they let me in their cool club.
And we want to talk about occupational licensing today. Most people, unless you're kind of a Federalist Society or other legal type nerd, the phrase occupational licensing doesn't cross your lips. So, what exactly is it, and why should the normal person care about occupational licensing?
So it affects everyone. I think years and years ago, something like 5% of the workforce required a license to work from the government. Now it's like 25%. It's really bad. People are like, oh, but doctors, you don't want to de-license doctors. No, I don't want to de-license doctors, but we're licensing florists and hair braiders. And we're not allowing nurses to do the things that they're qualified to do. So it doesn't make any sense. Um, so it's something that's really important because not only does it stop a lot of people from working and makes it harder for a bunch of people to work, even if they do jump through the hurdles, it hurts the poorest. It drives up the cost of care, the cost of goods and services, and it criminalizes innocent people. So if you're mowing a lawn, if you have to have a license for that, you wouldn't necessarily think you would need a license, but in some states you do, or cutting hair, or stuff like that. And in most of these cases, it's totally legal if no money's exchanged. But if it is, it's suddenly dangerous. So clearly, the money is the evil thing here. But it really affects everyone, and I think people are just starting to understand that now. And I'm late to the game too. Many people have been doing work on this far longer than I have, and long before I was alive. But I'm glad to be a part of it now, and I'm glad that I can help spread the message. And it's funny, I have like 50,000 followers on Twitter, and they're all interested in licensing reform just because of the stuff I tell them about. And it's nice because I care deeply about it. So being able to spread it is really important to me. But yeah, you just hear these stories of these innocent people just not able to do work for no good reason. It's not about health or safety. It's just that they don't have a license. Because getting the license is sometimes an insane process. Like one of my favorite points is that the old Louisiana florist exam used to have a lower pass rate than the Louisiana bar exam, and it's not because florists are stupid. They know what they're doing. The reason is because licensed florists judge the exam, and when they judge the exam, they don't want a lot of new competitors, so they don't pass a lot of people. That's really what it comes down to. And it's wrong, and it's not okay, but unfortunately, it happens. So it just gets to my heart, and I love being able to help out with it. But it's just, it's something I really care about. So being able to be part of the solution is really heartening for me personally.
So you mentioned when you were talking about some of this stuff, the requirement somewhere that you get a license to mow lawns. And sometimes I've seen some of these examples of licensing requirements. And at first, my initial thought is, yeah, that's probably made up or exaggerated. And it turns out that usually they're actually not. But where is it that somebody is required to get a license to mow lawns?
I don't remember offhand. That's a good question, though. But basically, a lot of very basic garden and landscaping is regulated stuff that's pretty much the equivalent of it. Um, but I forget what exactly the license is called. But if you look into it, you can find it pretty easily.
Okay, and then you mentioned another thing talking about florists. You said,
Mhm.
well, what about these in Louisiana? For a while, the pass rate for the florist exam was lower than the pass rate for the bar exam. And you said, well, it's not because they don't know what they're doing. And that seems okay, fair enough. Maybe they do or don't know what they're doing. Do we care, or do we have a right to know whether a florist knows what they're doing when they are clipping flowers and putting them into a vase?
It's called Yelp or reviews or whatever. There's a million other ways, and also government doesn't make sure that only the good ones get in. It's nice to think they do, but that's not what happens. And also, you might not like one florist's arrangements and the kind of work they do, and that's okay. You can just go somewhere else. But it's not harming someone to allow them to practice their job. And that's basically where the line needs to be drawn at actual health or safety. Although the supporters of the florist license have tried to say it's about health or safety, which is asinine.
How do they try to back up that claim that there's some health and safety issue?
They talked like about infected dirt, that, oh, you don't know if there's infected dirt. It's dirt, it's fine. Like it's dirt. Like you'll live. Like so they've made some really really dumb arguments, like basically along the lines of infected dirt, and courts take them seriously because of the rational basis test, which basically means if the case is regarding an unenumerated right, one that isn't written down in the Constitution, then they don't really take the right seriously. They just defer to government for no reason. So in this case, they deferred to government saying that it's dangerous to have unlicensed florists, even though all states except Louisiana don't license florists.
Has the florist license in Louisiana, has that been undone or changed by either a lawsuit or by the Louisiana legislature yet?
Years ago, they got rid of the floral arrangement exam, but there's still a written exam, which is still really dumb.
So in order to be licensed, you don't have to actually arrange any flowers. You have to take a test on it, a written test.
Right.
Oh, brilliant. So
Yeah.
correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm guessing that this test requirement, license requirement, it wasn't a bunch of Louisiana state legislators sitting around saying, gosh, we have a real problem with these florists out here causing all kinds of sickness and injury and whatever. So what actually happened, or what is the typical thing that happens that causes a licensing requirement on something that has absolutely no connection with health or safety?
So, I forget the origins of this license, but most of the time it's more about lobbyists or government helping out their friends, or there ought to be a law. Like, you might not like something, but as long as no one's harmed, there probably ought not be a law, which is pretty much what it comes down to. And the reason it stays is lobbyists and boards wanting to feel important, and industries wanting to feel important and not wanting competition. It's just very anti-competitive, just more regulatory capture. Sometimes there's other reasons, but that kind of covers it broadly, all the different main reasons.
Okay, you used a term there that not everybody knows. Regulatory capture. What's that?
So regulatory capture is basically when government, when a regulated entity basically gets to regulate itself and regulate oftentimes its competitors out of the industry. So in these cases, the incumbents get to make the regulations and they get to keep other people out. And it's not always for good purposes. Oftentimes it's nefarious. They just want a monopoly. Another good example that people might be able to relate to is with Facebook. If Facebook is able to have a hand in regulations and it's regulated itself, it's probably going to end up hurting its competitors for a bunch of reasons, including that newer companies are going to have trouble complying with the same kind of stuff as Facebook. So even if the companies have good intentions, it can still hurt newcomers, people who aren't already in the industry, and cause monopolies.
That's one of the things I always find interesting. And so what I'm about to say has nothing to do really with climate change per se, but I hear sometimes people say, well, oh, see, even Exxon wants climate change regulations to be imposed upon them. So see, they're even admitting that, gosh, this climate change stuff is real. And so even Exxon agrees. And maybe that's true and maybe it's not, but I think what usually is at least part of what's going on is Exxon or these other big oil companies, they know that if there are very detailed regulations on them, that prevents somebody from coming in and competing with them because they have the resources and the knowledge built in to comply with all of these regulations. And that has nothing to do with actual climate change. It has to do with protecting their place in the market, which has been hard earned over many years, and they think that it's worth protecting in whatever way they need to protect it. And that's just a classic case of regulatory capture that may or may not reflect Exxon or whatever big oil companies' views on climate change. Okay, so enough about regulatory capture. Federalist Society is nonpartisan, but often, well, not often, especially in popular media, it is always associated with Republicans. Rightly or wrongly, that's the public view of it. On occupational licensing as an issue, is there an easy way to break it down between Republicans, Democrats, liberal, conservative, or anything like that?
Conservatives are both part of the problem and part of the solution. Both parties are strongly part of the problem, but Republicans are more part of the solution. Democrats are getting on board too, though. Like, it was really big when President Obama, had his report out on licensing, saying that it was a problem, which I appreciated. Um, so that was really big, and also like the Democratic governor of Pennsylvania has been a really big help. He's tried to push it in his state, and he's doing a really great job there. But we just always need more of that. And there are a couple of Democratic legislators who are really great that way. But again, we could just use more of them. Most of the reformers end up being Republicans, but it's not exclusive. And Republicans care about the stories and their local people, but also about regulatory reform broadly. While Democrats might be into regulatory reform a little bit, but their focus on licensing reform tends to just be on like the heartbreaking stories, which is great though because then we can get everyone together and working together.
Is there a philosophical reason underlying conservatism, liberalism, progressivism, any of those isms that would explain why one side may be more motivated towards occupational license reform?
I mean, Republicans just tend to want smaller government, and they often, say they do and don't really. But for those who really care about it, wanting to get rid of unnecessary and overly burdensome regulations, and smaller government is just part of being a Republican. And for libertarianism, it's also that plus letting people do whatever they want to do. And then for Democrats, it's just a lot of it isn't as always as philosophical, but they genuinely care about people, even when I might disagree with the way they go about it or their ideas or something. They are genuinely people focused. On that side, they should want to do it more for those who aren't already. But sometimes they mistake protectionism for consumer protection. But both sides can easily be guilty of that.
So where is all the action on these issues? Is it that, Tip O'Neill famously said a few decades ago, all politics is local. I think to a large extent that may have been turned on its head and now all politics is national. Where are these issues being played out?
Most of it plays out locally and on the state level, but there are some national solutions. My colleague and I have done probably the most work out of any place of just figuring out a bunch of different national solutions that still respect federalism. Sometimes tying stuff to funds, military angle, and a couple of other things as well. Just studies that would have to take place on the national level. But most things happen on the state and local level, and that's where they should happen. Although courts should take a stronger hand in overturning unconstitutional ones that aren't actually focused on health and safety, but just protecting businesses from competition. But so for the most part, it's state and local, but a little bit national.
So you kind of you were reading my mind on my next question. So a lot of the things, some of these have been fought on constitutional grounds, and some of them are just fought on policy grounds. How much of this is occupational license as a violation of a constitutional right, whether state or federal constitution, and how much of it is occupational licensing reform because the current occupational licensing rules may be constitutionally permitted, but they're a stupid idea and they're bad for our economy?
I mean, I think they're all unconstitutional because we have a right to economic liberty, and it's an unenumerated right, but it's one that still exists. And then both the Ninth and the 14th Amendment, for reasons that I won't bother getting into because it takes a while to explain, but they make clear that our unenumerated rights deserve equal protection to enumerated ones. So I think that they're all unconstitutional, though many conservatives would disagree because they don't think that the Ninth Amendment means what it says. It's not to disparage them, just we disagree there. But everyone kind of thinks they're just dumb and bad laws. And there are bad laws that are constitutional and good, and potentially good laws that are unconstitutional. But in this case, I think it's just both. But again, the courts don't always give the due protection to unenumerated rights, so that causes problems when they go through court. So sometimes there's just more success seen in the legislatures and with governors' help.
So how do we? So you mentioned earlier that we're not trying to say that doctors don't need to be licensed because there's a genuine health and safety issue there. How do we figure out when the regulation violates our constitutional rights, and when it's maybe a good idea, maybe a bad idea, but it's not unconstitutional?
You do the opposite of the rational basis test and you put the burden of proof on government to prove itself. If government could actually prove, hey, if we don't license florists, here's the data on what'll happen and here's why, and you lay out the logic and the rationale, then okay, license florists. But they don't have that. They don't have any actual data. They just have the occasional anecdote and lots of hypotheticals. Our rights ought not be restricted based on hypotheticals, but on reason, data, science. And there's not that data won't always exist because some things have just been licensed forever, or they're in the rare cases where every state or almost every state has a license. But in many of these cases, the license doesn't exist in all states. So you can use comparative data like, hey, Louisiana, you're the only one licensing florists. Let's take a look at how it works out for all the other states, and you'd see it's fine. Or even if there is a health and safety danger, does licensing solve the problem? In the case of cosmetology, it actually doesn't. Lots of cosmetologists are practicing unsafely. Foot tubs are infected with various bacteria that shouldn't be there, and they're not cleaning their tools properly. But I wonder if that would get better or worse if they weren't licensed. I know people think the answer might be obvious, like, oh, of course licensing helps, but does it? Because it's not always how it works. So looking at the facts and data, California is super heavily regulated for cosmetologists, more so than other states, and they're not really safer from any data I've seen. So boards need to release the data so we can take a look at it. And if government can prove there is a real health or safety interest, that can be fixed with licensing, or at least made significantly better with licensing, then that's fine. But usually they can't prove that. So they go to hypotheticals and hide under the rational basis test and put the burden on the person challenging it to disprove to prove a negative, basically, which is ridiculous. That's just not how proof works. You can't prove something doesn't do something.
So here's one of the questions that I have that I think is as a legal, philosophical, constitutional interpretation issue, it's a tricky one on these. So you said that the government needs to have the burden of proof. We need to flip rational basis upside down and put the burden of proof on the government to prove why we need these regulations and why they're going to make health and safety better. The question I have is, who gets to decide, and should it be judges, either elected or unelected, depending upon whether they're state or federal, and if they're state, what state they're in? Should it be judges, or should it be duly elected legislators who are subject to standing for re-election periodically?
Well, it should be everyone, because legislators have a hand in the constitutional process, and legislators don't often do this, but they should be asking themselves, hey, wait, is this constitutional? Again, I know I'm a dreamer, but that's how it ought to work. And then when it goes before courts, we have due process in every other way, there's problems in the justice system for sure, but we're supposed to have due process there. And here we don't even pretend to under the rational basis test. So if they can prove, hey, look, when hair braiders aren't licensed, here's data that shows that people die, like lots of people are dying. Okay, so that's, we need to license them. For doctors, I think it's pretty obvious. And then for other occupations, similar kinds of things. So it should be basically everyone deciding every step of the way. And courts aren't always going to get it right, but they're never going to get it right. And the other branches won't always get it right.
Well, folks, thank you for listening to that interview. If it sounded like it ended a bit abruptly, it's because there was a technical glitch that killed the last couple minutes of the recording. I hope you enjoyed it anyway, and maybe even learned something. This episode of the Personal Responsibility Lawyer Podcast is brought to you by my law firm, Lovins Trosclair, where we use the civil justice system to hold people responsible for irresponsible choices when those irresponsible choices cause serious injuries and sometimes even death. We are personal injury trial lawyers, but we approach our cases a little differently than a lot of other lawyers who do the same basic kind of work. I really, really hope that you do not need us, but if you do need us, please call us before evidence gets lost. You can call us at 512-535-1649. Tell us you heard about us on the Personal Responsibility Lawyer Podcast. You can also go to our website on the interwebs at www.ltlegalteam.com. That's L as in Lovins, T as in Trosclair, legalteam.com. We are here to help. Thank you so much for listening to the Personal Responsibility Lawyer Podcast. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe in Apple Podcasts or on iTunes. And also, if you enjoyed the show, please leave us a review. It really does help to get the word out about the show. And now I have to do some disclaimers where I say stuff that you already knew, but I got to say it anyway so that I keep the state bar happy. This podcast is not legal advice. You listening to this podcast does not make me your lawyer or you my client. Neither does it make any of my guests your lawyer. If you want me to be your lawyer, contact my office. If I can represent you, we will execute a written contract stating the specific terms under which I agree to represent you. Did you really need me to tell you that? I really, really hope not. Also, I am not certified by the Texas Board of Legal Specialization as a personal responsibility lawyer because they don't know what that is. They also have not certified me in any other areas of specialty that they actually do recognize. I think that does it for disclaimers. For Lovins Trosclair and the Personal Responsibility Lawyer Podcast, I am Michael Lovins. We'll see you next time.